Tomb Raider is a 1996 action platformer developed by Core Design and published by Eidos Interactive, originally released for the Sega Saturn, Microsoft Disk Operating System, and PlayStation. Since its release, it's had a number of ports from the PC to the current line of smartphones, but this review will be featuring an emulation of the original PlayStation version. I like to use the original copy I have, but my capture software is a piece of shit. Aside from some small graphical inconsistencies, the emulation pretty much does its job spot on, so treat this as a review of the PlayStation version. With that said, let's jump to the game. Tomb Raider's gameplay is split into the main component that houses all the tombs, traps and challenges, and Lara's home, a simple tutorial stage where the player can free roam a relaxed environment. This is the best place to start as it eases players into the core platforming mechanics and transitions nicely into the main story. Here the player will get a grasp for Lara's various flips, how to climb, walk,
if you want to look around, press and
roll,
I'm having some things put into storage.
look around,
It into my own personal gym.
short hop, long jump,
If I do a
shimmy,
because the gap is too small.
and how to swim. It's a shame that the game doesn't use this area to introduce players to the combat mechanics as well, given how much action the player sees throughout the story. It's good that the game provides a safe haven purely for control testing, as it's the biggest hurdle modern gamers will have to overcome when going back to this title. 20 years after the game's release, we've seen major improvements in how 3D action titles are navigated, and having all those advancements stripped away to this degree can sadly be enough to deter a good amount of players. Lara's movements feel very digital, due to the decision to use tank controls, and also unhelped by the fact that this game was developed before the existence of the DualShock 1, when analog control was introduced to the system. Where other games of the genre simply let the characters move in the direction of the digital pad or analog stick, Lara first has to be facing that direction before moving forward. Left and right on the digital pad only changes Lara's direction. Backwards on the digital pad will result in either a short hop backwards or a backstep, depending on if the walk button was held down. The reason for this is because the game's combat lacks a lock-on system. Since Lara has no command to keep an enemy in her sights, her whole movement scheme is based around allowing her to jump while facing a single direction. This allows her to flip and shoot at enemies in every conceivable way without constantly needing to reorient herself. But the cost of the combat system is the rest of Lara's movements. Even the simple act of running around in a circle can become very jerky, since Lara only moves when forward is held down. This can be extremely off-putting, given how other titles in the same genre handle themselves.
Sorry about the crate.
Her response time to the jump command is also very laggy. In fact, when instructing the player on how to cross longer gaps, she'll even outright say to hit the jump button before making the leap.
Press forward and almost immediately press and hold the jump button. I won't actually jump until the last minute.
I fully understand why Lara handles the way she does movement-wise, but the delayed jump is unnecessarily clunky. It's an artificial way to make some gaps tougher to cross, and will occasionally lead a player to just walking off the ledge to their death instead of the desired short hop forward. A more responsive jump would definitely go some way towards making the game feel more fluid and fun to play, but as things stand now, Lara's control mechanics have considerably aged.
Right, this is a really big one.
The movement system is what will ultimately keep most people from experiencing this title, so I will mention that for the most part, the game does a good job of designing its stages with Lara's movement limitations in mind. With a little time spent out on the field, navigating Lara can come much easier to you. I'm not excusing Lara's poor controls, but they're not as insurmountable as they may initially appear. It's a shame that Lara herself is the game's barrier to entry, but I can't say I don't see where opposition to playing this title is coming from. After Lara wraps up the tutorial with an explanation of the swimming mechanics, it's time to get out of those wet clothes and into the main adventure.
Now I'd better take off these wet clothes.
Tomb Raider follows Lara Croft, an insanely wealthy British archaeologist whom, after surviving a plane crash at age 21, has become bored with domestic life. Some redneck that's trying to get into her pants introduces her to Jacqueline Nadla, a businesswoman that wants her to hunt down an artifact in Peru, a portion of the Scion of Atlantis. Though a little hesitant at first, the promise of a good adventure is enough to get Lara up and going. After a brief introduction to the area where we get a characterizing moment, Stage 1 begins. The caves act as a tutorial in case the player has decided to jump into the game right away. Lara simply has to navigate through a linear stage of fairly easy challenges. Some camera scripting will point them in the correct way forward, and the enemies introduced here are fairly tame, the most threatening of these being the bear. This is where players can come to grips with the game's combat mechanics should they choose not to simply cheese out the enemies by keeping out of reach. The most effective way to engage in combat is to simply jump in one of 4 directions with a quick tap of the square button and direction while holding down fire with X. This works well enough in the open spaces provided in the stage, but I wouldn't be surprised if some players struggle with getting these maneuvers right 100% of the time. Even after completing the game, I'll still occasionally jump directly upwards instead of my intended direction in the midst of a firefight. I don't think this issue would have occurred with a more responsive jump command, but Lara isn't likely to die here due to lack of control responsiveness. As linear as the stage is, there are some little secrets hidden off the main path here and there in the form of health pickups and ammunition for weapons yet to be discovered. It's a nice way to incentivize examining the area thoroughly. All in all, the stage won't take players over 15 minutes or so. It's direct and easy to navigate, and a good way to let players get their feet wet. The city of Vilcabamba is where things begin to open up a little more. Lara is still essentially navigating from point A to point B, but getting there means scanning the area and various branching paths in order to open the way forward. This also sees the introduction of my least favorite mechanic in Tomb Raider, the movable blocks. In short, Lara can move around square chunks of the level geometry in order to allow herself to reach new areas or simply open the way forward. When the blocks are used as a simple road barrier, things are painless enough. The block only has to be moved 1 or 2 spaces to keep things moving. When you realize you need to move a block to advance forward, part of you just dies a little on the inside, especially since it's entirely possible you can push a block the wrong way, only to realize you're supposed to take it another direction. This is a painful experience because Lara takes for fucking ever to push a block 1 space. She goes through this annoyingly slow animation full of grunts and groans, as she drags the thing a set amount of distance before having to reset the animation to continue to move the block. It takes her over 5 seconds to drag the thing from 1 space to another, and when you combine this with blocks that need to be moved 6 or 7 spaces, you quickly get the worst puzzles in the game. This stage makes it even worse by highlighting a space on the ground here that's useless if the players already managed to pick up the item on the ledge in the corner. If they drag the block there thinking there's something else to be discovered, they're gonna have a bad time pulling the thing back to where it needs to be. This entire process is just too slow. Nothing is even accomplished by having the animation play out like this. I could forgive it if this was like some way to mask a hidden load time, but there's never a point where the blocks could even be remotely considered hiding an area that needs loading. It's an overall slow and clunky mechanic that really shouldn't see so much use over the course of the game. This stage also introduces the game's first proper swimming puzzles, highlighting Lara's insanely long breath meter. Players may be hesitant to explore submerged areas, but after a few dips in the central well, they'll likely get comfortable spending long amounts of time underwater. I especially like how liberal Lara is reacting to things in this state. If she's in the vicinity of an interactable object, holding down the X button will cause her to slowly drift to where she needs to be in order to properly do what she needs to do. It makes the level of precision needed underwater much lower than it would be otherwise. I'm also really fond of the way the game handles its camera highlights. After flipping certain levers or switches, the camera will cut to what is being affected in order to give you some direction. But the entire time this is happening, Lara is still fully under the player's control. So after flipping a lever underwater and having the camera cut to another area entirely, the player can get started on swimming to the next section immediately if they can keep in mind where Lara should be. This also means that Lara is still vulnerable during these brief cutscenes, so running through a horde of enemies to the next door is a less rewarding proposition than it would be otherwise. There's more bridging paths here than the previous stage, but Lara is essentially still pushing forward. Once the initial locked door is open, she only needs to make her way up 2 towers before pushing through and completing the stage. The Lost Valley can either be a fairly short stage or a marathon depending on how the player goes about exploration. Upon entering the stage, they can either choose to go up or downstream. If they head upstream successfully, then they'll be given some direction on what they need to do via the machine they find at the top of the river. Find 3 cogs to place in the contraption. If they head downstream, then they can stand to be a little misled. Since the previous 2 stages were about advancing forward, the player may find themselves getting stuck when they can only find loops and dead ends. They can get an idea that they're supposed to be collecting cogs by finding some in the area, but then they have no reference for how many they need, meaning a player could potentially pick up 1 or 2 cogs, head back upstream, discover they're a few cogs short, then have to make a trek back down. I like that it's only taken 2 stages to introduce this kind of freedom to the player, and from this point on, the game will conform to this style of level design. Lara still needs to get from point A to point B, but now point B is initially very close to her, and she needs to venture off in a more sprawling area, gathering the things she needs in order to proceed. This feels less like advancing through a linear platform stage, and more like proper tomb raiding. This stage also houses Lara's first boss fight, the T-Rex. I like that Lara can opt out of the fight entirely, and instead choose to search the area while taking cover. Here I opt to fight the T-Rex in order to highlight Lara's generous auto-aim. The AI knows that I'm out of reach, so it makes an attempt to pull itself out of range, but despite being across the map, Lara maintains her aim and it's only a matter of time before it's cheesed out. The auto-aim was a crucial part of what makes the game's combat functional, but I don't think it should have been this generous with her targeting. Once Lara has found the 3 gears and inserted them into the machine upriver, it's on to the Tomb of Qualopec. Like the previous stages, Lara's goal is only a short distance away from her. If anything, the level design here feels more like a Zelda dungeon. To make her way forward, she only has to head down 3 different hallways and solve the puzzle down each path to reach a lever that will open one of 3 gates to the prize. 2 puzzles are relatively simple, and one is like a little more challenging, but there's nothing here that will stop the player in their tracks. I just like the way some gaps are framed, like this one here where a short hop will clear a bed of spikes. She just snaps in place over the gap in an awkward fashion when really the ceiling should just be raised a tiny bit higher. The player may have to repeat some of the challenges again, since the levers needed to open the gates have to be pulled in a certain order. This feels like an artificial way to extend the playtime in the area since none of the challenges are particularly taxing, but once the gates are open, Lara claims the first piece of the Scion and escapes the tomb. We're treated to a small cutscene where Lara resolves to chase after the other pieces of the Scion to set up some context for the next set of stages. Considering the time frame this game was made, the voice acting isn't as terrible as some of its contemporaries. Lara herself sounds very natural, but the people she interacts with really ham up their performance. It's 80s cheese from start to finish.
I'm sorry. This piece you say, where's the rest?
Miss Natla put Pierre DuPont on that trail.
The following cutscene where Lara breaks into Natla Industries to find the location of the next piece is what really got her character to grow on me. She just blow torches an elevator wire, rides the momentum to the top of the building, breaks in, and then just casually reads the information she stole within enemy territory, even making herself a little comfortable. She's got this air of a classy thief about her, one that can't be bothered to evacuate to a safe distance after performing a robbery, because she really doesn't have any fucks to give. After she discovers the location of the next piece, it's on to the next set of stages.
Each night, I beat myself rid of these fantasies, but it is indeed a test.
Pierre, you litterbug.
St. Francis Folly is where Tomb Raider's level design really begins to pick up. It follows the philosophy of the previous 2 stages, only taken to the next level. That first time the player lays their eyes on the central tower of the Folly can be quite intimidating, especially when they see just how much tomb there is to raid. Before they get there, they first have to make it past the entryway and an encounter with Pierre DuPont. These encounters are just pure PS1 jank. Basically, the premise of these next 5 stages is that Lara is racing Pierre to the next Scion piece. So in order to help capture that feeling, he'll just randomly pop up in certain areas firing at Lara. Since you've been able to kill every enemy you've encountered up until this point, the player may end up wasting precious ammo for their power weapons on Pierre more than they should, when really he just vanishes into the level geometry after taking a certain amount of damage. I think if the game had more of a budget, these portions would have been handled a little better, but as of now, it's just something that kinda happens. He pops in, you shoot him, and then he walks into a corner in the level and just vanishes. It's really bizarre. The block puzzles in this area can also throw off players if they think that it has to remain on the switch to keep these doors open. It's entirely rational to think that moving the blocks off the switch will close the door, and if you have that mindset, then progressing forward becomes literally impossible. It's only when you realize that the doors are open permanently that you can make your way forward. The central tower initially seems very intimidating, but once you start pushing your way through, you'll see that things aren't as bad as they seem. It's just the sheer verticality of the space that makes it appear pretty daunting. While it may not test your brain as much as you initially think, it will test your patience. Since I'm using the emulated version here, I've had the good fortune of using save states, but the original game, aside from the PC and smartphone versions, restricted your saving to certain points. If you miss a jump, get pushed off by an enemy, or get done in by one of the traps in the stage, then you might have to replay a good chunk of the level again, depending on how you've managed your saves. There's a single save point at each level of the central tower, but they still need to be managed wisely around the challenges, something hard for a new player that doesn't know what to expect. Pierre also returns in this area, and he's able to shoot Lara from the bottom of the tower while she stands at the very top. Again, he's just pure PS1 jank. Lara has to safely maneuver around the central tower in order to access 4 different challenge areas. Some of these challenges have held up a little better than others, but some could stand to be a little more creative. In particular, I like the Atlas challenge and its utilization of the 180 roll. It trains players on an effective method for descending platforms. The 4 challenge rooms all has a key that opens a way to the next stage at the base of the tower, so once those are all completed, Lara can move on. The next stage is the Coliseum, and I'll be frank, this is the first stage that stopped me dead in my tracks for one reason: this entrance. Maybe I'm just like a person with special needs, but finding that 3rd floor entrance to the main portion of the stage really had me stumped for a good while. Basically, if you run into this main building, a fucking lion eats you, so then you find this little path off to the side and you're like, oh, this must be the way. So you climb to the 2nd floor and then you find that trail that leads to a health pickup, then you spend like the next 20 minutes or so checking around for something you missed. Turns out the side of the building has a 3rd floor that can be accessed almost as soon as you jump to the 2nd floor. In retrospect, it's like really obvious, but I admire how well some of this stuff is hidden in plain sight. Once inside, you'll get your first real look at the game's limited draw distance. The idea is that this grand Coliseum is sunk underground, but unfortunately, the team couldn't get all of it to display in one sitting. Once again, Point B is very close by, right across the field of the Coliseum. But to get there, Lara has to make her way through a few traps and puzzles. These are all handled well enough except for the one in this room here, which comes off as a little more PS1 jank. I know Tomb Raider is like really fun in this square build design. Most platforms and land masses are made from blocks with textures. But why did a gate switch have to be like a different colored block? It's one of those things that's like obvious in retrospect, but really if you're just exploring around, you could be forgiven for not thinking this block is a gate switch that needs to be walked on. Once you know what it does, advancing forward is easy enough, but couldn't the switch have been designed a little better? You know, not just be a different texture in the same level geometry? It makes the puzzle feel a little artificially difficult. Basically, the game's graphics are muddying the way forward. Aside from that, the puzzle structure does well in ensuring that the player doesn't find themselves backtracking the incorrect way. Though the player has access to the entire Coliseum from the get-go, they're led around in a logical and satisfying manner until they're ready to advance forward. Palace Midas is a roided-up version of the Tomb of Qualopec. Of the tombs so far, it definitely gives the player the best sense of raiding ancient ruins. The area becomes immediately sprawling, and the order in which things can play out is very open to interpretation. The mechanic with the statue of Midas is what really gives the place its tomb raiding feel. For those people not keen on Greek mythology or watching Disney's Aladdin where he finds the hand of Midas, anything it touches turns to gold. So naturally, being the gold digger Lara is, she cashes in on that shit. But unfortunately, the emulator can't handle gold Lara, so it makes her invisible instead. Really, the hand is only used to make some objects usable keys, but its inclusion is really good for immersion. Lara is scouring the world for Atlantean artifacts, coming across ancient Greek civilizations, and dealing with some supernatural elements along the way. It gives the story that sense of adventure. Lara is basically female Indiana Jones, but much more sophisticated. The level design in Palace Midas is very admirable, but it does present Lara's first real issues with the combat mechanics. Up until now, Lara's had plenty of open space to deal with the enemies, making the flip and shoot strategy viable. In condensed areas, the enemy count was lowered, going some ways to curb the difficulty of limited movement. Here, the enemies show up in clumps, and some spaces in the level make the flip and shoot strategy a less viable proposition. This is made worse when there are multiple enemies that can outmaneuver Lara. If she gets caught in a cluttered room full of enemies, the only viable strategy is to find a spot to cheese out the AI. Using power weapons like the shotgun, magnums, or Uzis go a good deal towards alleviating this problem, and further rewards the player that took the time to thoroughly investigate their environment. Because they were thorough, then they're more likely to have a stronger firearm when they need it. But I know certain players dislike using limited resources until a boss encounter calls for it. Something about just charging limited ammo on common enemies doesn't feel right to them. But advancing in this game pretty much demands it, unless the player is willing to go the extra mile to cheese out the AI. I guess now is a good time to talk about the cheat system in the game. Once upon a time, before DLC was prominent in the marketplace, AAA developers would put little goodies in their game from the testing stages as bonuses. One of these is the ability to access all power weapons from the get-go, along with enough ammunition to sustain a full playthrough. I think it's worth mentioning this because it provides a way to opt out of the game's combat, which is easily the weaker part of the game. Going back to this game 20 years later, Tomb Raider is still very enjoyable on a purely puzzle-solving basis, and if someone wants to go back for the brain teasers without the clunky combat playing a heavy role, then I would point them to use this cheat code. This does come at a price, being how much the player is rewarded for finding the hidden pickups, which is essentially just ammunition for power weapons. If the player does opt out of combat, then finding the hidden areas with ammo stashes becomes meaningless. If the player toughs it out with limited ammo, relying on their pistols for the first half of the game, then the reward for exploration is immense when you're able to bust out the shotgun in times of need because you did your tomb raiding duties thoroughly. It all comes down to how you feel about the game's combat, which can understandably get a little frustrating at times. Cheat tangent aside, Palace Midas is a satisfying level to complete, save one room. Basically, Lara has to make 4 perfect jumps over some torches in a limited amount of time before they fry her. Making 4 simple jumps quickly would be an easy challenge enough, if not for Lara's jump response time. Up until this point, her delayed jump shouldn't really be a problem since the player has all the time in the world to get things right, but here it's demanded that the player cross the gaps perfectly without any slowdown. If you land too far ahead on a block, then Lara won't start her jump in time for the next gap and go plummeting into the water below. If you have to pull yourself up, then you're already too slow to make it without getting lit on fire in the end. Thankfully, they put a save point right before this challenge, but this series of jumps is some really frustrating shit, and it only highlights how bad Lara handles under pressure. The margin for error here is very slim. Hell, even getting it right, I was still moving too slow to not get burned. I had to cheese out the puzzle by shimmying on the side. The remaining stages of the second Scion piece hunt are all very well designed. The Cistern introduces a water level mechanic that could potentially halt the player's progress unless they keep on top of the level geography. Aside from the sliding block puzzle in the end where the player is asked to lug a block into another room, again, the pacing here is very good. The Tomb of Tihocan keeps the water level mechanic from the Cistern, utilizing it in an entirely different way, rewarding players who explore thoroughly by giving them access to ammo before flooding the same area, allowing alligators into the equation. The level ends off with Lara seeing her second boss fight, a guardian statue, come to life. This is also the final encounter with Pierre, where you can finally put the little prick in the dirt. The boss here can be pretty intimidating if you have to fight him out in the open, but the game makes the mistake of allowing players to enter the tomb before the boss is killed. Pierre has laughably low health compared to the Guardian, and the reward for killing him is the second Scion piece, magnums, and a key to the next room. The game attaches the magnums here for a good reason, but before I get ahead of myself, Lara needs to have visions of the final piece of the Scion, cluing her into the next set of tombs. Despite this being Stage 10, the City of Khamun, Obelisk of Khamun, and Sanctuary of the Scion can really be thought of as one massive tomb, and the third stage in Lara's adventure. Stages 1 through 4 all took place in the mountains in Peru, and stages 5 through 9 all took place within and underneath St. Francis Folly. The previous 2 areas were one massive trek from point A to point B, with many sprawling areas in between. Stages 10 through 12 all interlink with one another, and you can find yourself covering the grounds of Stage 10 while in Stage 11 and vice versa. Since everything here is the most interlinked, I'll just cover stages 10 through 12 as one big tomb. These set of stages make the best argument for a player to opt out of combat due to the mummified versions of the Atlanteans. They're incredibly mobile, and you're often placed in cramped spaces with them. At its worst, you're hounded with multiple enemies that are insanely durable and maneuverable. Oh, is that not fun? Here, have a boss while we're at it. Really spice things up. The game knows it's amped up the combat difficulty, so it hands out magnum ammo at any chance it gets to basically scream to the player, if you're still using the pistols, you're gonna have a bad time. Liberally using the magnums, I never dip below 400 rounds. The enemies themselves aren't the problem because when you have the space to deal with them, even your weakest weapons can carry you through the fight. It's the decision to crowd you in with multiple punishing enemies that can be very frustrating. At least killing them results in a satisfying explosion. Fucking douchebag. Level design wise, I'm amazed at how many ways they keep the puzzles fresh, given how limited Lara's moveset is. You'd think the ideas for traversal would run dry fairly quickly, but they find a lot of ways to keep the tomb rating from growing stale. Some of this is by pilfering and tweaking elements from the previous tombs, like having a sand shift mechanic instead of a water level mechanic, but as a whole, it's an enjoyable set of puzzles from start to finish. The only negatives I can find in the level design was to once again utilize the block mechanic by having you drag it from one end to the room, then back to the other. You know what? You suffered so much, why not let you cool off with a mummy, you piece of shit? I harp on about the combat because this was the only point I felt cheated by the game's mechanics. When I think back to this section, the moments where I was swarmed with punishing enemies stuck out to me, but subtracting those moments leaves you with the best designed tomb in the game. It's one giant puzzle from start to finish, and it's easy to lose yourself in the treasure hunt on a moment-to-moment basis. There's skis to find, geometry to alter, heights to scale, lakes to plunder, traps to avoid, puzzles to solve, a little touch of the supernatural. All the previous stages have been building up to this. One massive tomb split into 3 parts that the player can roam. It's just a shame that the mummies had to be a downer on the experience. Making it to the center of the Sanctuary of the Scion, Lara puts that redneck in the dirt for the final piece. True to 80s movies fashion, she's ambushed by Natla and her cronies. Stripped of her weapons in the Scion, she pursues those goons with her knowledge of Trial's fusion.
What the heck was that?
True to her character, after making it safely on enemy territory, she just picks a hiding spot that could easily be checked, then falls asleep. Oh, Lara. Not a single fuck to give. After the boat arrives at its destination, it's on to the final crop of stages. The Atlantis stages kick off with Nadla's mines. Lara starts out the stage without any of her firearms and has to recover them as she pushes forward. It makes for some nice tense moments should you come across one of Nadla's cronies before having your pistols in hand. The process of getting your pistols back involves gathering 3 fuses to lower an unfinished room. I don't know why it's like this, where the bad guys is like, oh hey, we have Lara's guns, should we keep them? Ah, fuck you, now they're up there, she'll never get them. We could have just thrown them in the lava. Oh, well, I'm too lazy to go up there and get them. Anyway, the fuse puzzles are the most straightforward portion of this crop of stages, save the boulder puzzle. Again, Lara is asked to make several jumps perfectly in a certain amount of time. Failing to do so means leaving the area to reset the puzzle and try again, which is definitely a test of the player's patience. Atlantis in general begins putting more pressure on Lara to perform tasks under pressure. Some of these are reasonable, but as the player progresses, there'll be more sudden shocks to their traversal, while they'll be asked to perform a specific set of actions under a time limit. The enemies here are more punishing than the ones in the commune stages, but I actually find them more tolerable since Lara is usually given enough space to deal with them. The worst use of enemies I could think of is in the doppelganger room. Basically, Lara comes face to face with her doppelganger that will mimic her every move, at the same time as 3 Atlantean enemies, all of which have the same ability as the mummies of the previous stage. To top this off, Lara has no control over who she auto-targets, so if she targets her doppelganger, she'll end up damaging herself, since the doppelganger can also fire projectiles back at her. Aside from this instance, the enemy placements are far better than they were in the commune stages, and power weapon ammo is in abundance. I never dipped below 400 Uzi rounds and was able to use them liberally with every enemy I encountered. Cheating or not, the player will most definitely be stacked out on ammo at this point. The Atlantis stages feel less like a sprawling tomb, and more like an ascent to the final area. It harkens back to old adventure films, where the hero has to fight their way past the main villain's henchmen while traversing their lair of traps. Speaking of henchmen, Natla has Atlantis guarded by several human captains. Now there's 2 things I want you to take from this review. That time Lara Croft stormed the ancient civilization of Atlantis and found that there was a subculture infatuated with popular 90s trends like skateboarding, and that Samus Aran, the most fearsome bounty hunter in the known galaxy, has the best black friend that's 80 feet tall that she's actually pretty chill with because he makes her feel special by calling her princess.
Remember me?
No. For some reason in this ancient civilization, there's a skate park, and a Mexican skateboarder who's gonna do some sick tricks and talk smack to Lara. You need to understand the context around this. In the 90s, skateboarding culture was everywhere, and the hip thing to do. Want to make something instantly cool? Throw in a fucking skateboard! Somehow, even though it logically just shouldn't be there. The premise of this fight and where it's placed is just hilarious. I know I said the controls have dated the game, but fuck man, this moment right here, this is what dates the game. After Lara has progressed upwards past all the traps and captains, Lara attempts to get her hands on the Scion, leading into the fight with the legless mutant. This is perhaps the easiest boss fight in the game, as Lara simply needs to maintain momentum and keep out of reach. Even after liberal use of the Uzis throughout the stage in the boss fight, I wasn't even close to running dry. There's more ammo around the area for the final fight, but first Lara has to go through an escape sequence to get out of there. The escape from the pyramid isn't timed, instead it's multiple sequences of mini challenges that need to be completed back to back. By this point the player's grip on Lara's movement should be good enough to pull them through these, but I wouldn't be surprised if they stumble here along the way. The end of these challenges is a fight with Nadla, which is laughably easy. Lara needs only to choose the power weapon she wants to do the job, and use the many health packs she's likely to have on hand when her health runs low. It's a nice send-off fight before the final platforming segment leading to Lara's escape. For a game released in 1996 in the time of early 3D, I was surprised to find how little I struggled with the game's camera. It's almost never a problem. Unfortunately, the final room in the final area is the one place where the camera became uncooperative. I had to make a life or death leap, hoping I was facing the right direction. Trivial for the emulated and PC versions, which can save anywhere, but a devastating proposition for someone who may have to repeat the escape sequence in boss fight. After the leap of faith, Lara goes sliding down the pyramid firing guns akimbo, making her escape as it explodes behind her, concluding the game. Tomb Raider is a satisfying collection of brain teasers that expand on themselves in logical ways throughout the game's progression. Given how minimalist Lara's movement options are, it's impressive how the game managed to keep its traversal from getting stale. The story is fun in an 80s cheese sort of way, with a protagonist that's built to feel very inviting. Lara does what she does because she loves adventure, and her attitude carries over to the player who can find themselves getting into the tomb raiding spirit as the complexity of the challenges build. I know some people critique this version of Lara for being nothing but a mindless sex symbol, but ironically it's those very people who are being sexist. They've judged her solely on appearance without having a clue as to what she does. This is a person that has a natural curiosity, and lets that curiosity drive her across the world. This is a person that will steal from you and make herself comfortable at home while doing it. This is a person capable of some over-the-top shenanigans that'll make you crack a smile because of how either cheesy it was or how clever it was. The new generation of gamers have a new Lara that they'll grow up with, but hopefully this game's barrier to entry isn't too high for someone with a curiosity of her history. It's rough around its edges, and some mechanics work far better than others, but underneath it all is a solid core experience.